The big C conservative argument that Guantanamo can't be closed amounts substantially to the argument that it's just too risky to put dangerous people in American prisons. You'd think that if there's one thing Americans left, right, and center could agree on, it's that we're good at locking people up. My lifespan in this country has been roughly the time of the largest experiment in mass incarceration in the history of the Western world. In trying to make that argument and in trying to contextualize the arguments against closing Guantanamo, I have frequently on this show listed some of the well-known people we've got in prison in this country, people who give lie to the idea that our country can't reliably operate any sort of prison deadbolt. Terrorists like Omar Abdel-Rahman, the Blind Sheik, and Eric Rudolph, and Timothy McVeigh, and the Unabomber guy, and Richard Reed, and Charles freaking Manson have all been imprisoned in someone's hometown in America without incident. Even very well-known people like the Unabomber, Timothy McVeigh, Ted Kazinski, Richard Reed, Ramzi Youssef, Zacarias Moussaoui, Richard Ramirez, Eric Rudolph, Charles Manson, all some examples of bad guys who have been safely held in U.S. prisons. Among those people that I mentioned, the Unabomber, Theodore Kaczynski. He was convicted of a domestic bombing campaign that began in 1978 and lasted nearly 2 decades. He killed 3 people and injured 23 more. His targets were mainly universities and airlines, bastions of the modern technology that Mr. Kaczynski despised. Living alone in a very small cabin in Montana, it wasn't until 1995, when parts of the Unabomber manifesto was published in newspapers, that Mr. Kaczynski's sister-in-law shared her suspicions with her husband David that Ted might be the Unabomber. David, Ted's younger brother, recognized his brother's style of writing and beliefs in the manifesto, and eventually he took his suspicions to the FBI. Ted Kaczynski was arrested at his remote cabin in Montana, April 3rd, 1996. He's currently serving a life term in the federal Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado. David Kaczynski, Ted's younger brother, has since devoted his life to the issue of people with mental illnesses in the criminal justice system and to campaigning against the death penalty. David Kaczynski is executive director of New Yorkers for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. For the first time, he has written about his relationship with the brother he grew up with and admired in a collection that's titled Brothers, 26 Stories of Love and Rivalry. He joins us now. Mr. Kaczynski, thanks very much for making the decision to be on the show. Thanks for being here.
It's a great delight to be with you.
When you see those clips from this show, how does it feel to see your brother used as an example of a dangerous person who's being kept safely away from society in prison?
It just feels incredibly sad. Ted's life didn't start out that way. He was a brilliant student. He was a good big brother. He was a kind person. I think until he became mentally ill, he was on track to become a real contributor to our culture and our society. And unfortunately, because of his mental illness, things changed dramatically. So it almost, in some ways, feels like you're talking about somebody else, not the brother I knew.
You've devoted your adult life to activism against the death penalty, and I know that the Justice Department sought the death penalty against Ted, but in the end, they did not succeed. His life was spared. He's serving a life term in prison. Why do you think that they sought the death penalty against him? Did you understand that decision, and how did it make you feel?
Well, it made me feel awful. It made me feel betrayed. They knew that Ted was mentally ill, and yet I think they sought the death penalty because there was political pressure. This was the Unabomber, after all, person responsible for the longest-running, most expensive criminal investigation in the history of the FBI. I think there was political pressure to do it.
Yeah. Have you had contact with people who survived attacks by your brother, or people who are family members of those who he killed?
Most have found one way or another to thank me. My mom, Wanda, and I had a very moving meeting after the trial with one family that lost a loved one. I'm actually almost best friends, very good friends with one of Ted's surviving victims, Gary Wright of Salt Lake City, who's just a wonderful guy. And for me, that's a silver lining. Gary is very dear to me and a close friend.
One of the reasons, of course, that they would be thanking you is because it was your decision, after you read the manifesto, suspected that the Unabomber might be your brother Ted, that you ultimately went to the authorities.
I have to correct you, okay, Rachel, only in the sense that my wife Linda really is the unsung hero. She was the first person to suspect, and the decision we made was very much a joint decision between two people who love each other very much and share some basic values.
Did you know what to do once Linda shared her suspicions and you started to realize that you might share them? Did you know what that meant you would have to do and how you'd go through with it? And I understand it was a long, complicated process.
Well, the most agonizing part was, of course, the realization that no matter what we did could lead to somebody else's death. If we did nothing, the end result might be that if the Unabomber was my brother and struck again, we'd have blood on our hands. Someone would have died because we had failed to act. On the other hand, we also understood that turning in Ted could result in his death if he was found guilty and sentenced to death, and that was just agonizing. It felt like an absolutely horrific dilemma to face.
Ultimately, how did you decide?
I think ultimately it was the realization that Linda and I both shared, that we just couldn't live with ourselves if some other innocent person had died because we had failed to act. We had to do what we could to save innocent life, and then we had to do whatever we could to save Ted's life.
Have you had any contact with Ted since that time and since he's been incarcerated?
I've only seen him at his trial, and at his trial he didn't acknowledge me there. Mom and I still write to Ted. Unfortunately, he never writes back. It's almost as if he's in two prisons. One is, the federal maximum security prison where he'll spend the rest of his life. The other is this prison of mental illness, which may be just as cruel.
When we're debating now as a nation, and in some ways within the Beltway, in some ways really coast to coast, about what to do about the threat of terrorism. I mean, your brother's a very specific case when it comes to terrorism. It certainly was, in his mind, politically motivated violence that he was committing, politically motivated murders. In the larger context of the war on terror, it's hard to fit him into that sort of a concept. Do you see his case as a terrorist case? Do you feel like learning about what happened to him, what caused him to do what he did, gives you any insight into how Americans should be thinking about terrorism?
I actually think, though my brother committed technically, legally, acts of terrorism, that the best way to understand what was going on with Ted is to understand that he has schizophrenia. Yeah. On the other hand, I think it's very clear, I'm not an expert on prison security, but to my knowledge, nobody has ever escaped from a federal maximum security prison. And I think we can rest assured that people like my brother and the terrorists who are locked up in Florence, Colorado are not getting out. They're not going to be able to hurt anybody else.
David Kazinksi, who is the brother of Ted Kazinksi, who is known as the Unabomber, who is a contributor to this new book, which is called Brothers, and who is the executive director of New Yorkers for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. Thank you so much for being willing to come on the show and talk about this. Thanks for writing about your story, about your relationship with your brother in such moving ways in Brothers. It's a really amazing essay that you've written. It's really nice to meet you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Coming up on Countdown, Keith finds out about the testimony of the gentleman from Texas who was known affectionately to his friends as Turd Blossom, though I would never call him that. Next on this show, my friend Kent Jones reports on the escalating battle between a very small dictator and a very